defense of the biblical flood myth, young Earth creationists often equivocate that Noah did not gather two of every species, but rather two of each kind of animal. Yet they never seem to agree on what a kind is. But one concrete thing we know about the biblical use of the term is that kinds must be able to bring forth or successfully reproduce, and only animals of the same species can do that. Biblical literalists typically deny evolution by natural selection, or at best acknowledge microevolution, but deny macroevolution. The trouble with this equivocation is that it's a distinction without a difference. In fact, the only difference between microevolution and macroevolution is time. But let's address the creationist contention that Noah only took different kinds of animals onto the ark. The pairs of animals must have been able to produce fertile offspring, otherwise there would have been no reason to take them on the ark in the first place, except as food. So, if the ability to produce offspring is the determinative characteristic of kinds, it brings us full circle to species, and it would be physically impossible for all of them to fit on the ark. As one might expect, the highest order of creationist nonsense can naturally be found at Answers in Genesis. So let's start there, shall we? In an article called Fixity of Species, A Lesson in Changing Definitions, author Bodie Hodge drones on about the origins and changing definitions of words like species and how kind might mean either genus or species, whatever suits the creationist argument of the moment. But as is clear from the biblical text, kind cannot mean genus, because only members of the same species can successfully procreate. Hodge winds on a bit more about changing definitions and then goes completely off the rail about the religion of naturalism. But he never defines what a goddamn kind is. In another article from AIG, Species and Kind by Dr. Gary Parker, the author begins by, as is typical, misrepresenting evolution, and concludes with the absurd statement, extinction would be much more likely than evolution. He prattles on with hypotheticals and eventually vomits up, all we have ever observed is what evolutionists themselves call subspeciation, variation within kind, never transspeciation, change from one kind to others. Setting aside for the moment the fact that transspeciation of the type that Parker mentions in the article when he says, life is supposed to move from simple beginnings to ever more varied and complex forms, molecules to man, or fish to philosopher. Within the short amount of time we've been directly observing evolutionary processes would in itself be contrary to what evolution predicts, Parker engages in the usual creationist propaganda that boils nicely down to blah blah blah, quote mine Gould, smear evolution, God did it. But despite the title of the article, he too never defines what a goddamn kind is. Leaving Answers in Genesis, we find an article from the Northwest Creation Network, which takes on the kind argument by stating, related populations instinctively remain reproductively separate following a period of isolation, and eventually will become genetically incompatible and unable to mate. Speciation does seem to occur on a fairly regular basis, and along with independent selective pressure has caused the biblical kinds to become a plethora of uniquely specialized communities. A single species or more from each kind has essentially evolved into many genera of species. So, if kind means the ability to successfully mate, species, how the hell can evolving into many genera, an even higher taxonomic classification than species, not mean transspeciation as per the AIG article? Finally, in an abstract on biblical kinds, Christian author Carl Drews analyzes the 31 uses of the Hebrew word mean, translated kind according to Strong's Concordance number 4327. In Leviticus, the use of mean is so specific that it indicates even various developmental phases of the same species. Leviticus 11:22, the locust after his kind, the bald locust after his kind, the grasshopper after his kind. Note that there is no taxonomic difference between locust and grasshopper. The term locust is used for grasshopper species that change morphologically and behaviorally on crowding. Not even a different species of animal at all, but multiple phases of development of the same species. And in Deuteronomy, very similar birds are said to be different kinds. The glede, the kite, the nighthawk, the hawk, stork, heron. Drews says the biblical usage of kind is close to the scientific usage of species. The biblical phrase after their kind is commonly interpreted to imply fixity of species in Genesis 1, but this interpretation is not consistent with the usage in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. Species is defined scientifically as reproductive isolation. Organisms are of the same species if they can interbreed successfully, and are of different species if they cannot. And later in the same abstract, he states, according to standard evolutionary theory, the child is always the same species as the parent. By any test of speciation, reproduction, or morphology, the parent and the immediate child are the same species. It is only after a large number of generations that we notice a substantial change in the biblical kind. He summarizes the implications as follows. A new biblical kind has emerged when an observant layperson can reliably tell them apart, the Adam test. A new biblical kind has emerged when Noah would have to take breeding pairs of both child populations onto the ark in order to preserve the existing lines of biological descent, the Noah test. In other words, after enough generations, it is possible for a new biblical kind to emerge, or as creationists like to call it, macroevolution or transspeciation. We can also conclude that in order to reconcile the Noah fable with known science, one must define kinds as species and acknowledge that through evolution, millions of new species have emerged. But the numbers and diversity of extant species could not have evolved from the seed stock Noah had on the ark in a mere 4,400 years, no matter how tightly he packed them. To sum up the aggregate creationist position, a kind must be able to produce fertile offspring, and a kind can evolve into new species that cannot interbreed with other animals of its ancestral lineage. Yet they remain the same kind. So let's do the math. A equals B and A does not equal B at the same time. Therefore, you guessed it, God did it. If this kind of convoluted reasoning makes perfect sense to you,
error.